People of the Caribbean are some of the friendliest you will meet. This makes them unsuspecting of a hidden danger. What is this danger? Illegal bioprospecting, commercial exploration without consent of naturally occurring substances such as plant and animal DNA and microbial species. Traditional knowledge can also be exploited for profit. How does illegal bioprospecting take place? Well, picture this. You innocently tell a tourist about the plant your granny made into a tea to soothe your achy tummy when you were a child. You then wave goodbye to your new friend, who really wasn't a tourist at all, but a researcher in disguise. That person now takes away a piece of the plant to be analyzed for the secrets to beauty and health it may hold. If it turns out that one little leaf has commercially viable properties for medicine or cosmetics, some international company can make billions of dollars while you and your country derive no benefit. This is referred to as biopiracy or illegal bioprospecting. These kinds of tourists are the real pirates of the Caribbean. Responsible bioprospecting, however, is a good thing. When commercial users of biodiversity and genetic resources comply with established legal requirements, they can be allowed mutually beneficial access to bioresources and traditional knowledge. This is how many beauty products and life-saving drugs are discovered and sold. One document that can assist to regulate the access to genetic resources and traditional knowledge is the Nagoya Protocol. Throughout the Caribbean, the application of the Nagoya Protocol has been a challenging but ongoing process. Some of the main areas of concern are explored in this documentary. They are legislative reform and policy setting, regulating access to traditional knowledge and genetic resources, benefit sharing from research, as well as public education. From one island to another island, the Caribbean region has vast endemic genetic resources, as well as generations of traditional knowledge. For this reason, there is immense bioprospecting possibilities, but with few laws in place to govern access and benefits, there is also exposure to biopiracy.
The Caribbean is a biodiversity hotspot. It has a lot of biodiversity richness. It's a small region, but it's very diverse. Not only for resources, not only for biodiversity, but also for culture, for people. You can find every kind. It's a melting pot. That's what people said about the Caribbean region. And you have enormous resources that are not even in the land, are in the sea, in the ocean. The transboundary characteristics of those resources make it very important for the countries to understand what is at stake, why they have to protect them, and what is the impact of protecting the biodiversity that could generate as well incomes for the governments, incomes for societies, incomes for the communities.
This can only be achieved through legal reform that regulate the fair and equitable sharing of proceeds that emerge from commercial research on natural genetic resources. Access and benefit sharing, or ABS for short, are regulations enshrined in the Nagoya Protocol, which is a supplementary agreement to the Convention on Biological Diversity, an international treaty which recognizes the importance of biological resources.
The Nagoya Protocol is about accessing genetic resources, respecting the countries of origin of these genetic resources, but also benefiting the people from the access to genetic resources. It's about sharing benefits. It's about having the right legislation for people to be able to get the benefits of their own genetic resources in their islands. is about trying to protect the traditional knowledge that is associated with the access to genetic resources. It's telling the community that knows how to use a plant for a medicine purpose or for a cosmetic purpose, that the knowledge is going to be respected, and that their knowledge is not only going to be shared, but also they're going to benefit from sharing that knowledge with the rest of the world.
In the case of the Nagoya Protocol, it is very important that there is new regulations or that a legislative framework is developed, because there are very practical things that need to be implemented into the country to make the protocol work. So for example, you have to designate a competent national authority, a national focal point. The competent national authority would be the one to determine who would get an access permit to access genetic resources. So these decisions have to be made usually by law, or you can also do them by regulations, but it's necessary. And it will also depend on how advanced the country or the government is in the developing of a legislative framework and an institutional framework to implement the protocol.
Within the Caribbean, laws that manage responsible bioprospecting and benefit sharing are inadequate. Knowledge and understanding of the value of natural resources are not widespread. In order to address these gaps, projects have been undertaken by the UICN.
UICN has been working in the Caribbean for the past 15 years. We have been supporting governments and people to adapt to climate change. We have been working on access to genetic resources. We have been working with people to conserve the ocean. I mean, we have been there just helping people to achieve a Caribbean that value and conserve nature.
Through the GEF-funded project, Advancing the Nagoya Protocol in countries of the Caribbean region, the UICN has been facilitating workshops and consultations with 8 countries of the Caribbean: Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, Trinidad and Tobago, and Grenada, in an effort to encourage their governments to adopt the Nagoya Protocol into the legislative framework of their countries. In implementing the project, one of the lessons learned is the many challenges to legal reform, which will allow enactment of ABS legislation in the region.
What we have found in most of the countries is that the environmental regulation is spread in many different regulations and acts, and it's not like a single act that regulates all natural resources. So we have been faced with the challenge of deciding whether we want a standalone legislation on ABS, or if we want to change some of the acts already existing that usually regulate only one type of resource. So for example, one act for fisheries, one act for forestry, another for land use. So with most of the countries, we are evaluating the decision of whether to implement a whole new legislation that would establish a comprehensive legislative framework for ABS, or to change some of the existing laws. So in my opinion, it's best to implement a standalone legislation that would implement a comprehensive system for all resources, because otherwise what happens is that if you implement an ABS framework for fisheries and another for forestry, there we can have some gray areas that do not fall into any of those regulations. However, usually to implement a comprehensive framework, you would need a whole new law, so that would take a lot of time.
The makeup of the protocol allows countries to individually define their challenges and to tailor policies to suit ABS regulations. This is especially beneficial in the Caribbean, where complicated and politically charged legal systems and the many steps to enact new legislation often deter new bill proposals being presented to Parliament. St. Lucia is one example of a country opting to attach ABS legislation onto already established environmental laws, rather than implement a new act.
The legislation that we have at the moment, we do not have an all-embracing piece of legislation. We have several different pieces of legislation that deal with conservation of resources. We have the Forest, Water and Soil Ordinance. It's a very old one, 1946, but it deals with conservation of resources. We have the Fisheries Act of 1985, which deal with water, or obviously water and fisheries. Then we have the Forestry Act. We also have a biodiversity, conservation and use bill of 2009, which is in draft. What we need to do is to see how we can marry, take bits and pieces from those different pieces of legislation and come up with a hybrid model that deals with access and benefit sharing in a way that is sustainable, that is environmentally friendly.
As I said, the current legislation, well, there is nothing about competent national authority, there's nothing about mutually agreed terms, there's nothing about prior informed consent. These things are critical to really helping the users of the resource work with the providers, so the people on the ground. I think the current legislation does not really allow the people on the ground in the communities to really benefit themselves, maybe nationally, but not the people on the ground.
The UICN has been primarily assisting St. Lucia in particular through capacity building and with technical assistance. And technical assistance in the sense of coming to the countries, looking at the national situation in the countries and working together with the focal points at the Department of Sustainable Development to put together not only a policy, an ABS policy, but to work together towards a strategy and action plan. And that also assists the Department of Sustainable Development in putting forward a cabinet memo and supplemental to the Cabinet of Ministers in the hope that legislation will be put in place to guide ABS policy.
In the case of St. Lucia, we have been able to work very directly with their environmental division, and there has been a lot of interest in this subject, and the draft legislation is practically done.
Despite legal, political, and even cultural obstacles in some islands, by 2018, the UICN had achieved success with 3 countries ratifying the protocol: St. Kitts and Nevis, Antigua and Barbuda, and Guyana. The latter 2 has established ABS domestic frameworks.
I think there was pressure on the government of Guyana to join the Nagoya Protocol. It's seen as a very good thing, and we'd had a session on the Nagoya Protocol in December 2013, and we brought in 2 shows from the interior of Guyana representing various Amerindian communities, as well as conservation organizations in Georgetown, as well as the Environmental Protection Agency and the University of Guyana. And so there was this tremendous energy from that workshop where people began to realize that Guyana's wealth is actually in its biodiversity, and this is something that people should cherish. It's actually something that should be preserved for future generations, so used today but also preserved for future generations. And I think the Nagoya Protocol is a very important part of ensuring that that happens.
In Antigua and Barbuda, non-commercial benefits have been realized from having environmental laws in place.
Antigua and Barbuda, they're already very far ahead in this process. They have already ratified the protocol and they have already passed legislation. So they are already working with a system on how to deal with ABS in Antigua and Barbuda. So in that case, the process is practically set.
Prior to 2015, we did not have any legal or regulatory framework for fielding these access requests for our genetic resources. So it resulted in a very informal system with difficult to track agreements. So in 2015, the Environmental Protection and Management Act was passed, and within that, the provisions for access to our genetic resources are enshrined in that legislation.
The legislation has been particularly helpful in regulating research on the uninhabited island of Redonda, in addition to the bird sanctuary across on Barbuda.
Before the ABS guidelines were put in place, anybody could do anything that they liked, and we have had issues here before in the past where scientists come, they take their stuff and they go, and then that's the end. One major thing, especially with Redonda and trying to keep it in this invasive species free status by having the ABS guidelines and telling them, hey, if you want to come here, we direct them directly to NACA.
Within a 2-week time span, we would review the application on its merits, we would review the research methodology, and then we would be able to say whether or not this is a legitimate request for doing research.
An essential benefit also to having ABS guidelines in place is the ability to take action on non-compliance with MATS, mutually agreed terms regarding research.
We have the measures in our legislation that, that speaks to like what happens if a researcher does not comply with the agreement. So we have blacklisting, we have, broadcasting this transgression on an international media scale so that, people are aware. We have that we can, repatriate the material back to Antigua and Barbuda. What it will come down to is working with counterparts in other regions of the world to enable compliance.
St. Kitts and Nevis has been the most recent country to sign onto the protocol in September of 2018.
St. Kitts and Nevis, they have just ratified the protocol, and we are also developing for them draft legislation and a draft national policy. And since they have already ratified the protocol, they already have a binding obligation at the international level to implement the protocol.
Inasmuch as the UICN has made progress drafting ABS legislation in some of the islands, others have made little to no progress, with challenges still being addressed.
In terms of our actions towards implementing Nagoya in Grenada, we've had a number of stakeholder workshops and trainings here on the island. But in terms of governments actually agreeing that it's time to sign on to Nagoya, we do have some work to be done on it still.
In Grenada, we have been working with them in the developing of draft legislation and of a national policy. So we still need to see if this legislation is going to be presented and passed anytime soon. In the case of Barbados, we are also developing a draft of national policy and draft legislative provisions for them. So we still have to see how long it takes. In the case of Jamaica, we have been having some problems with the developing of legislation and of their institutional framework, because usually when we work with a national body, we need them to give us also some input on how to create this draft legislation or draft regulations, and we haven't been able to work very easily with them. So we're still on the first stage of the process, trying to develop something for them. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, we are also preparing a draft national policy and draft legislation for them, and they're trying to prepare a very strong cabinet note to present to the ministers so that it's a very easy decision to make.
Another challenge experienced in the Caribbean is a lack of ongoing capacity building measures. The various environmental bodies in each participating country have had a difficult time agreeing which government institution should be named the competent national authority. However, all of the countries have a national focal point. At the time of producing this documentary, only Guyana, as well as Antigua and Barbuda, have assigned competent national authorities. A competent national authority is the body identified in legislature to work with other environmental units, manage the process of securing prior informed consent, review mutually agreed terms, and grant access to research applications that meet ABS requirements. Caribbean countries are coming to understand that there are many benefits to a proper accessing environment or framework to genetic resources and a traditional knowledge. Allowing research can assist with sustainable and economic growth in the Caribbean, once the terms are fair and equitable. Each participating island in the GEF-IUCN project presents a host of endemic biodiversity and cultural practices to be studied, from reefs and swamps to bird sanctuaries and land-based fauna and flora, as well as traditional application of these resources.
You will find that in terms of number of endemics, the islands that are closer to the mainland, so Cuba, Jamaica, Antigua, St. Lucia, And going down the chain, the further away you are from the mainland, is the less you expect to have colonization happen, and therefore you would have less richness, so the number of species tends to be less. Trinidad and its islets are unusual because biogeographically they were formed from the southern plate, and this is part of South America, and therefore their fauna is completely distinct and different to the other islands that were associated and formed off of the northern plates. So in that light, Grenada is unique because of the fact that it doesn't have as many endemic species, and that's only expected. We still haven't fully explored all that we have on island, and in that light we would welcome opportunities, and we have welcomed opportunities, to partner with research organizations and universities to do further work to understand better our biogeography.
The research of genetic resources and the traditional use of genetic resources has given the world beauty-enhancing products, life-saving drugs such as anti-venom for lethal snake bites, and other medical applications, creating multi-million-dollar industries in first world nations. Little to none of these billions return in any form to host countries.
The Nagoya Protocol helps us to put in place the needed framework so that we can actually now invite those who want to come in for bioprospecting, invite those who are interested in blue economy options, to do this within a safe and organized context where users on island as well as providers on island can benefit, as well as users who are off island. So I would say that this is one of the major reasons why, under the Convention for Biological Diversity, Grenada has chosen to sign on to the Nagoya Protocol. It's a supplementary protocol, yes, but it deals with the third pillar of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is to support access and benefit sharing.
Therefore, if access to the genetic resources and knowledge held in the Caribbean is not fair and transparent, and regulated by comprehensive environmental legislation such as ABS, the region stands to lose economic and infrastructural growth opportunities. As an example, in the Bahamas, a microfungi called Salinospora tropica has been under research as a cancer-fighting drug. However, a shift from non-commercial to commercial utilization of the material took place when a transfer of the genetic material and research results from a public institution to a research-oriented company occurred. The Bahamas could have received significant benefit had mutually agreed terms been in place. And in another Bahamian case, a soft coral derived from the marine environment has been in use in a face cream produced by a multinational cosmetics company. Lucky for the Bahamas, the product cannot be synthesized, so care is taken in harvesting the coral to promote conservation of the reef and sustainable bioprospecting. Similarly, the venom of the Fer-de-Lance viper from St. Lucia has been harvested and is used as one element in the creation of an anti-venom for deadly snake bites. This medicine is currently sold out of Costa Rica.
We're now using an anti-venom which has come from Costa Rica, and that was developed by a gentleman, a researcher known as Jose Gutierrez. He is from Costa Rica, and that is affordable and is effective.
We produce two main types of antivenoms for Latin America and the Caribbean. One is called the polyvalent antivenom, and it works against all pit vipers in Central America, the Caribbean, and some countries in South America. So the Fer-de-Lance in Martinique, for instance, or similar snakes in French Guiana, in Trinidad, Tobago, in other countries, St. Lucia, for instance, as well as in Central America, this antivenom, polyvalent antivenom, is effective against all these snakes. This particular antivenom is created from the venom of three snakes: the Fer-de-Lance, which in Costa Rica we call terciopelo, the rattlesnake, and the bushmaster. We don't have the snakes here. We get the venom from colleagues in St. Lucia and Martinique, and we study the venoms, but we don't have the snake. We don't bring the snakes here.
Here in St. Lucia, that snake is not protected. And there's no laws that protect the intellectual property rights for this particular snake. As a country, we need to protect and develop and keep the intellectual property rights so that someone doesn't come from outside, gets the venom, develops the problem and St. Lucia does not benefit.
Unfortunately, no terms of agreement on the ABS guided regulation was in place regarding the use of the snake when permission was given for research.
Through this experience, we have learned that it is important to negotiate with researchers and prospectors to understand their needs as well as the needs of the country. And so the legislation that will be developed around the Access and Benefit Sharing Protocol will reflect this. It will ensure that the access is regulated and specific conditions are met for researchers and other commercial persons to begin accessing our resources.
The reality is, despite efforts, chances for biodiversity loss in the Caribbean still exist. This is partially due to a lack of institutional and human capacity to deal with issues of conservation, sustainable use of biodiversity, and research. Recently in Barbados, a microbial parasitic species was sent abroad for testing with no contractual terms of agreement in place.
Well, there's an insect called the avocado lacebug that we would have seen in Barbados in the last 3 to 5 years. There are no natural enemies to this. So it is difficult just to control it using conventional sprays. If you can get something that controls it, you can then use that. You can develop it, commercialize it, and then you can sell it as an agent. For want of a better word, you can sell it as a pesticide. We came across this particular leaf that had on the insect, but it was being parasitized by this pathogen, by this, for want of a better word, this fungus. We don't have the expertise inland in the island to look at that and identify this, but we do have what we have a working relationship as also with other labs throughout the world, and so we would have sent off a sample of what we saw to this particular lab in the United States to see if they can identify what was causing this parasitization, this entomopathogen, whatever it was. And this is something that we normally do. In small island states, if you don't have the wherewithal and you don't have the people to identify these things, you will always be behind the last, you know. It's difficult because it calls for a certain amount of expertise, especially when you're talking about taxonomy. And these bigger countries have the expertise. So it is more of an informal agreement in terms of what would happen if they find something, but there is a formality to it in that we do have a marriage understanding with these particular entities. So as an accredited lab, it is your duty that whatever you find, you send back to us. Not only that, you cannot use it for other countries or to give to other people without our knowledge at first. So we would have to say, yes, you can share it before you do. That is part of the agreement between us and these entities.
This loose form of agreement is what the project Advancing the Nagoya Protocol in countries of the Caribbean region aims to eliminate, so that genetic resources, while being explored, are also protected and the findings made known and benefits shared.
How does a country protect its genetic resources is a challenging question, but one which the ABS regimes are trying to address. Following from the fact that genetic resources and traditional knowledge are common to all, the question then rises once again as to how to protect it. So where a country sends genetic resources somewhere else, or where someone more importantly comes to that country and takes out the genetic resources, the only answer lies in contract. In the absence of contract, there's no protection.
It is imperative, therefore, that terms of use when accessing biodiversity are addressed as thoroughly as possible within contract. This is especially important against the threat of synthesization.
More recently, synthetic biology has emerged and is of particular concern and interest to the islands. Synthetic biology mainly deals with the artificial production of natural biological systems. And the issues surrounding that deal with access to these resources and who in fact benefits from these resources. And for islands where we have and we want to support blue industry and blue growth, as well as green growth, which is more sustainable growth, both in the marine environment as well as on land and terrestrial and in our fresh waters. We see both opportunity as well as the concerns to make sure that this happens in a very balanced manner.
The medicinal use of marijuana is one of the largest discussions to date worldwide. A billion-dollar empire waiting to explode on the fringe of research. Who would be able to identify the host countries from which this plant is being accessed and researched, and to whom benefits should return? Although marijuana use is not legal in many constitutions, people of the Caribbean have been known to use this plant for generations.
Maroon, we deal with all bush. We eat also deal with bush and ambush. So cannabis, marijuana, it include and involve in all our medicinal, supplements.
Recognizing the island's vulnerability to illegal bioprospecting and the value of benefits to be derived from proper access to its genetic resource, Antigua and Barbuda became the second of the 8 Caribbean islands participating in the UICN project to ratify the Nagoya Protocol. What they have learned is the intrinsic advantages of non-commercial scientific research governed by ABS environmental laws.
We've had 3 or 4 successful research expeditions in Antigua and Barbuda, and from all of these we've received data from the researchers. And they've sent us pictures, and we've been able to log this information in our natural resources inventory, which we envision will be on our website so that the general public has access to this information and they'd be able to learn more about the environment as well.
In Antigua and Barbuda, the local unit that manages Redonda has derived information and built databases through relationships with researchers.
Redonda for many years was only known to Antiguans as having goats and rats, and that was exactly what it was, goats and rats over there. But also over there was a number of important species that are found nowhere else in the world. Over on Redonda, we have 3 species of critically endangered lizards, the Redonda ground dragon, the Redonda tree lizard, and the Redonda pygmy gecko, which was only discovered in 2009 and is still being genetically described. In addition to the lizards, we also are an important bird area. This is a global recognized designation, and it's due to the amount of seabirds that we have nesting there. Brown boobies, masked boobies, red-footed boobies. We also have magnificent frigate birds.
Access for commercial use, however, should be more tightly controlled and monitored, as this applies both to the resource and to the knowledge of how to use the resource. The project also addressed the vulnerability of traditional knowledge in the Caribbean.
Whatever our great-great-great-grandparents would have known for their existence at that time, they were able to live a very long life without any kind of maybe prolonged sickness. There were no doctors. There were no schools. They didn't know how to read and write like how we do today. But they were able to hold the things that we now enjoy as a result of their understanding how to preserve things for the benefit of generations to come. How they did it to ensure that we enjoy the things that they enjoyed had to be something passed on from generation to generation without written information.
This is traditional knowledge. The customs, innovations, history, and use of natural methods of healing passed down from generation to generation through oral traditions. It forms an invaluable part of indigenous or local communities, cultural identity, as well as an economic base.
Our traditional knowledge, I think, is very vast. In Guyana, I believe that we have a lot of information that we have not given out. And there is this discourse which is a little misleading, I think, where we are told that to help us preserve our knowledge, we can document it. But who gets access to that documentation is another thing, because somebody else gets to use it.
Traditional use of genetic resources found in nature is often as valuable, if not more so, than the genetic resource itself. This traditional knowledge can also be biopirated, or exploited for commercial research purposes.
There is still not a sense in which that traditional knowledge is valued. So I've seen time after time after time, for example, people come in as researchers and they go and they talk to the elders and they write down everything and they go away again and nothing comes back to the community. We've even had a situation where a scientist patented a substance from greenheart that was a traditional Wapashan remedy. So I think biopiracy is a significant concern, and it's one of the issues that the communities at the moment are not sufficiently well aware of. And I think it's one of the issues that a lot of work needs to be done. So people understand that actually what you know is very valuable. It isn't that you should just share it with someone, which has been the traditional way of doing things.
A lack of information is a major lesson the islands are grappling with. It is important that communities be equipped with adequate understanding of biodiversity and the value of what they own. The legislative process must then protect the resources and traditional knowledge by having the proper permitting systems in place.
We hasn't have that protection because there's a lot of people already been in this community and also the other maroon communities, and even write books about whatever they see, whatever rituals, whatever language, and publicize it, and the community does not benefit.
Even as one of the lessons learned confronts the vulnerability to biopiracy of traditional knowledge, there is also a vulnerability to loss of knowledge, as the younger generations do not appreciate traditions that are passed down from the elders. This is something that is in need of critical attention.
Most of the elders have died out with that knowledge, and most of the youngsters who the knowledge had passed to, some of them did not really take it serious, so it has been watered down for the uses of herbs, but also for the uses of our traditional dances and our spoken words, and even the knowledge that we have gotten orally.
Opportunities lost have spurred the indigenous communities of Jamaica and Guyana, which recognizes 9 indigenous nations, to active resolution planning, that going forward, systems can be put in place to secure benefit sharing.
Years ago, a foreigner came and got knowledge about a particular plant in the mountain and went away with that knowledge and never came back. So by that happening, it gave us, knowledge not to, especially to foreigners, not to do things that they're not supposed to be knowing. When I said things not they're supposed to be knowing, I'm speaking about the herbal medicines from the mountains. And by being in this workshop here, it made me start to think far beyond with our traditional knowledge should be respect. I mean, I don't want us to say that we will keep the knowledge for ourselves, but we should be doing the right things so we, the people that use and interact with our herbs, should benefit.
One of the ideas that we've been working with is to move beyond FPIC, to move beyond free prior informed consent, because you can give your consent freely. It can be given in advance, so it's prior, and it can be informed. You know what they're going to do, but you get nothing. So we've been working with communities to get them to understand free, prior informed, conditional consent. Put conditions, set the price, set limits on what people can do with your knowledge. Insist that they give you a report. Insist that if they're going to write an article, you must have co-authors.
I think most traditional knowledge actually was given away both by Rastafarian communities and Maroon communities, that we were freely giving of people asking us how do we use, for instance, Leaf of Life, and we would tell them that we use it like that or like this. And books were being written, and the Nagoya Protocol has helped to educate us on how to formulate these templates that whenever we have, because we do ecotourism also. So we want when students come, they could sign with us to say what is the access and benefit sharing to our community, that if we give the knowledge and so they make a film or a movie or use our knowledge to write a book, funds should come back to the community to help to build our basic schools or roads or infrastructural development. I think benefit sharing does not just come in finances, it can come in assistance of capacity building. And so I think we are getting a little more educated now in present time, and we are so glad that we were here for almost 15 years within the community with our machetes stopping people from just raping the things. We are encouraging more students to visit, because if the cruise ships stop coming, anything that goes for schools, I think can be sustainable. That the history department, the biology department and the social study department can actually make field trips to the community, and that helps also with preservation.
When limits and permitting conditions are set in legislation, responsible bioprospecting and access to traditional knowledge can be fostered, where mutual benefit can be derived by both host country and research entity. Commercial and non-commercial research, however, can often lead to claims on intellectual property rights, the creation and even transfer of patents. This is something that all countries must be aware of.
We don't have intellectual property rights legislation, right? And as I said, for indigenous peoples, it may be more a right of a people, intellectual property of a people, rather than an individual.
The role, therefore, of the ABS regime and the patent regime is always symbiotic, for want of a better word. And the reason for that then is the genetic resources, once taken, sometimes lead to the development of a patent. So in considering how to protect traditional knowledge, I think it must be very fair to all parties, and you have to balance interests. The interest to be balanced will be the interest of the community versus the interest of the person who puts in time, money and energy to develop the patent based on the traditional knowledge.
In treating with all facets to be covered by ABS legislation, there is a glaring lack of public education and communication on the issues of the policy itself. It is essential that governments and technocrats implement awareness initiatives. To popularize the concept of access and benefit sharing in the Nagoya Protocol, mainstream awareness and education are crucial. The present educational efforts of government technocrats in most of the cases are inadequate. An intensive awareness campaign is necessary to educate the indigenous people and local communities as well as other concerned stakeholders.
I believe that the Nagoya Protocol is one of the most important legislation that we have been trying to pass in recent times, because it not just impacts this generation but future generation. And so the level of awareness has to be saturated across the island, at the community level, at the technical level, at the experts level, but political will is also important.
St. Kitts and Nevis, who signed onto the protocol in September of 2018, recognizes the need for educating the public and highlights some mechanisms necessary to provide communication and awareness of ABS issues nationwide.
The persons who have more access to the information are persons like taxi and tour operators, persons within stakeholder ministries and the private sector. But in terms of the students in schools and the everyday person, that would be random. We need the buy-in of the media resources that are here locally, and then we need funding in terms of not just the print media, electronic media, all the areas of the media that people access. We need to especially pass this information on to our next generation. So we have to, of course, look at Facebook and Twitter and all of those. They don't take so much funding, but they take a dedicated resource person who would be able to update. If it's a website or a Facebook page, we would need a dedicated person, as well as funding for material to be sent to school, and of course dedicated persons who would update the schools and other institutions of learning, as well as the general public at the community level moving forward.
Likewise, in Grenada, there are gaps in educating the public on ABS.
There is still some challenges in terms of communicating the benefits of the Nagoya Protocol to the country at large and to the government, the opportunities it provides, for example, for economic growth, job creation, and the things that governments are interested in to help the economy to grow. But we have some challenges. The communication is a big challenge, as well as the public education and awareness. The general population is not really aware of what Nagoya is, and in terms of then putting pressure on government or encouraging government to sign on to Nagoya, for instance, we haven't made enough headway with that.
In January 2019, a regional ABS week was held in Trinidad and Tobago. Presentations from around the Caribbean engaged stakeholders both at government, sponsor, and public levels. Special interest groups and communities from countries within the project attended, such as the indigenous people of Guyana, the Rastafarian community, and the Santa Rosa First Peoples of Trinidad and Tobago, as well as Maroon communities from Jamaica. One of the main highlights was the schools debate, where the enthusiasm of participating students gave hope for the future of biodiversity conservation.
What I want to also highlight is the fact that you went above and beyond and you did the research. And for that, I say really and truly kudos to all of you. You really did well in getting the information. And I hope for those people who are here and for the technicians who've been here for the 2 days, you will also be proud of the fact that they went out and they got all the information. In fact, you've highlighted some cases that we don't even know about. So that is excellent.
It is events such as these that assist to put information in the public domain. While direct community outreach and workshops are great for one-on-one teaching opportunities for technocrats and high-level stakeholders, using mainstream media channels like television and online platforms is an efficient way the UICN has been getting the information out. However, more work is needed in each individual island.
Well, you have to be able to have the training of the people to understand, how the communities first and foremost, to understand the need for prior informed consent before anybody comes and studies what the genetic resources are all about. So it is important that the communities understand that, and then they teach them about mutually agreed terms so that they can enter into agreements with the users, possible users of the resources since they are the providers. You must go around to the communities and educate the people about the importance of the resources and the traditional knowledge also that is related to the resources.
To achieve effective education and communication across stakeholder groups, it is important to have the means, access, and systems in place. The topic must be widely relatable to the communities at large, the youth in particular, and to speak to governments on the direct correlation between sustainable biodiversity to GDP and economic growth. As some countries in the project move forward to ratify the Nagoya Protocol, others still struggle with legal issues, resource capacity, and awareness challenges that leave them vulnerable to biopiracy. Caribbean countries must therefore immediately action measures to adopt the protocol, encourage ABS compliance, and impose penalties on individuals or organizations that violate the agreements governing the use of genetic resources or associated traditional knowledge. This would significantly assist in protecting the natural resources of the country and stand as encouragement to other developing countries to implement similar measures.